Hello and welcome. I'm Rosemary Pena, President of the Black German Heritage and Research Association and Adjunct Professor of German Studies at UBC Vancouver. Our conversation today is the 7th in our spring event series themed Art and Resistance and produced in collaboration with Davidson College. Dr. Emily Fraser-Rath, our students, and I are excited to welcome our special guest, Goitseone Montsho, into our virtual classroom. But before our discussion begins, I'll ask Emily to please share a little about our work together before introducing and turning the conversation over to our special guests and our students. Emily?
Thank you, Rosemary. We are so honored to be able to invite Goitseone Montsho to our class, to Davidson College, and to the BGHRA today. Today is November 17th, 2022, and we, Dr. Pena, me, and most importantly, our students, are nearing the end of our 11th week together in our German 231 class entitled Black German Art and Resistance at Davidson. The class is conceived of in 3 parts. It's first a survey course in the fields of Black German and Black diaspora studies. Second, it is a community-based learning course as we support the BGHRA through our work and will feature our final projects on the BGHRA archive. And it is most importantly an opportunity for students, and through these recordings, our broader BGHRA and Davidson communities, to speak with people whose lives and work are at the intersections of artistic expression, resistance and activism, identity, among many other things in modern day Europe. For today's class, I would like to thank my colleagues in German Studies here at Davidson for making this possible. So thank you to Drs. Burkhard Hinke, Maggie McCarthy, and Scott Denham for your continued support and encouragement. And thank you to Amber McIntyre, our administrative assistant, for making these visits and everything around these visits and the behind the scenes possible. So in a moment, as usual, Dr. Pena and I will fade into the background and play moderator for the remainder of our time together in order to allow our students and Goitseone to have the floor. They have prepared incredibly insightful questions based on Goitseone's a short story, Safer Spaces, her performance of The Shape of My Anger, James Baldwin's 1963 lecture, The Moral Responsibility of the Artist, and a film that Goitseone has shared with us as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce our guest today and turn things over. So Goitseone Montsho is a South African poet, storyteller, performance artist, and chronic collaborator who's based in Berlin. She has published and held space in a number of publications and public spaces. Her work has been staged in Gropius Bau, African Book Festival Berlin, and Time of the Writer at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. In Basel, she participated in the Image Afrique Festival as both performance artist and poet. She has recently been featured as an essayist in the essay anthology, Could This Be Love? She is the co-host of the podcast Empty Table, which is an English-speaking podcast, but rooted in Berlin. So with that, I'll turn things over, and I hope, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. As Dr. Rosemary have said, my name is Goitseone Montsho, and I'm a storyteller and an Indigenous South African healer. I would like to situate myself in this conversation titled Art and Resistance by starting this session with a practice borrowed from a wonderful friend called Clementine Ewokolo Burnley, where I will start by archiving moments and years that are important to me as an artist. And I will start with the year 1938, which is the year that my grandmother Nomalanga was born. And her coming into the world changed the trajectory of my life, and I am because she always was. The year 1992, my little sister Nell was born, and her birth made me a big sister. And the year 2013, I became a mother, and looking back at the past dates that I just mentioned, I wanted to highlight the archiving of Black histories, how they are important, especially when one is an artist reckoning with histories of erasure, of denial, and of continued violence. I referenced James Baldwin's speech from 1963 titled The Moral Responsibility of the Artist as a guiding point for this engagement, because James Baldwin talks about the artist as someone who helps you see reality again. If you replace the word Negro with Black and or Indigenous peoples in this 1963 speech, you find out the devastating fact that we are still dealing with the same violence, having the same conversations, and circulating the same resistance in 2022. I am going to read a poem called White Consumption, which I believe speaks to this very profoundly. I secretly call this piece Gingerbread Man, and in a minute you will see why. White consumption. My grandmother told me she slaved for a white lady. 20 years my grandmother's junior, she insisted on calling my grandmother a girl. She ate my hands, Grandma tells me, as she shows me her arthritis-ridden hands. Your mother slaved for a white lady too, but she was tired, and they ate her heart. When I first started writing, a white lady told me she wanted to help me publish my stories. I refused. You can't eat me too. When I started to use my voice to tell my stories, a white lady said she gave me the opportunity on a stage with white faces, half smiling in the audience. I ran from her. I understood. She was here to eat me. When I was on a stage, a white man took photos of me without my permission. He posted them on Facebook and called it giving me publicity. I ran from him too. I understood. He was here to eat me. I don't know how hungry you must be to eat land, to take space, to take all there is, to eat our mothers, then come for us children. I don't know how hungry you must be. Pits for stomachs that never get filled. I'm still holding on to my stories. They are all I have. No land, no space, no mother. I am still holding on to my stories. They are all I have. And no, you cannot eat them too. So in my tradition, storytellers are very revered people. And this is because storytellers are the original archivists and the keepers of narrative. Therefore, storytellers have a great responsibility to the stories that they tell. The women in my family that I mentioned earlier, for example, all share with me the story of our lineage. But within that single story of all of us born women of the same blood and sometimes similar experiences, there is a multi-layered narrative. If my younger sister told my stories, they would be vastly different from mine. And it is that essence that I always try to capture in my storytelling. Storytelling and keeping the diverse facts of our existence, even when it's uncomfortable, is a form of resistance, because by doing so, I started to claim and hold a non-physical liminal space that exists between my grandmother's and my narrative, my mother's narrative, my own, my younger sister's narrative, and my daughter's future narrative, which is already in great contrast to my own. We might deal with similar elements, but we have a vastly different understanding on experiences. My job is to reckon and hold space for the validity and existence of all these multi-layered facts through storytelling. I gained the courage to perform my poetry after the birth of my daughter, who, to give you an idea of time, is 9 years old. When I started writing, there was a need in me to reflect on the world my daughter was growing up in, and on what I could do to meaningfully contribute to her environment. I started to interrogate the future as much as I did the past when my daughter was born. I did not intentionally set out to confront racist ideas or sexism or homophobia or all those other things that keep us boxed in. I wanted to simply see reality again and contribute to a sea of narratives that surrounded me, and to see if others saw what I saw. I found that the more I shared my work, that white institutions perpetually expected my art to teach them something that would enable them to see my humanity. I was expected, before I could even share my stories, to cuddle white experience. At times, I felt, and I also still feel like I had to be audacious and intentional about myself and my work. And I kind of made an intentional agreement that I would not write to them, that I would instead write to Nomalanga, to Boniswa, to Neo, to Malaika, and in turn to myself. And this is what I believe shapes the resistance in my art. I'm resisting projections, narratives of my people and myself. I'm resisting all of this by simply not considering them and their projections. Writing myself into being is my way of looking to enforce equitable treatments to narrative and making space for multiplicity in storytelling, specifically for Black people living in Europe, who encompass a myriad of experiences that are sometimes boxed into one for the convenience of white audiences. Also, this is not a new form of resistance. Our ancestors have collectively and individually practiced this. I always think of an excerpt from Toni Morris's piece As I Am, where she says, I have spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books. And it is in the same spirit that I try to create and write. I always imagine myself secretly as an African Renaissance writer who is captured in a fortress called global white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And everything I write is me being Harriet with a gun, but well, I just have my nimble fingers and a pen and moving through the underground railroad and writing myself out of white fantasies and myths of how people who look like me should move through the world. A film I created that I shared earlier called A Cowrie for Your Thoughts was created with the same sentiment in mind. As a poet, I think I'm a very wordy person. I love writing, and I started writing when I was like about 8, 9, when I first started thinking and writing poetry. But I wanted to transcend the word. I wanted to add other layers to it. And I was always inspired was by ritual masking, which is in many African tradition, occupies the liminal space between worlds of constructed physical realities that concretize our humanity and our sense of spirit with a capital S. For example, the idea of land ownership after the historic violence of land dispossession in South Africa. How do I, as a child of violent dispositions, concretize myself in this new world that acknowledges that what happened was violence, but wants me to accept the new system without proper redress, and where in me exists the knowing of the lands that my ancestors used to own that have been stolen, and that I, as a Black artist, have to swallow this knowing and continue to create work in systems that were built to not actually include me. And where even what I'm saying now sounds new and revolutionary, but is in fact something Mr. James Baldwin and many who came before me have been saying. 3 years ago, I felt like I had reached the glass ceiling of performing poetry, especially in the Berlin scene. And I wanted to try my hand at writing larger pieces of work. And so this also coincided with my work to become a South African traditional healer, because when one becomes a traditional healer, it's kind of very funny how not funny, but kind of like you actually have to rely on dreams. So you actually deal with a lot of realization of the physical world. And when one receives a calling to become a spiritual healer in my tradition, you kind of work with the past and the future, and the past, the present, and the future, they all exist here and now in this tradition, where there is no separation between the past and the present and the future. And this work made me aware of the stories within the story. And I started to work on my current work in process, which is a fantasy novel titled Nehanda, the Beautiful Ones. With this piece, I wanted to bring a sense of magic and enchantment into my work. I've always been inspired and informed by African cosmologies. In my work as both writer and healer, I aim to recover and restore, because one of the things colonial histories have taken from Black people and people of African descent is our sense of hopefulness. And we are constantly disappointed by a past that is not really past, by a present that can breed cynicism in the most hopeful of all of us, and policies that keep us dismembered from our sense of selves. So my work, I think with this specific work, I wanted to remember, and not remember as in recollect, but remember as in put together what has been pulled apart. And I found that when I started to read, which is my favorite genre, is fantasy, I found that when I read fantasy, many of the stories written by people of African descent or people from the afro-diaspora, I realized that there was a tendency to produce work that is tainted with the hopelessness of colonization and the effects of such histories, that they even permeate our escapist literature as Black people. It really made me sad. And there is a need for stories of our hurts and disappointments. And don't get me wrong, but I think for me, I was searching for the same magic that used to light up my eyes when my grandmother told me stories. I was searching for just this place where you could sit for a little while. And in African cosmologies, the past are the ancestors, the present is us, and the future is our collective descendants in the future. And they're always kind of present in the story in a non-linear fashion. And I think the best literature, which is quite subjective, is literature that reminds us of our collective responsibility towards one another, which is our capacity to inspire, which has the capacity to inspire change in our lives and shape our futures. It is stories that acknowledge our brokenness, but also acknowledge the courage of our spirits, collective and individual. And it is in the spirit that I wanted to invoke in this work in progress. It was this seeing reality again that I hope would also be ever present in the characters that I create in the future. And I think right now I am going to share with you a piece actually from this work in progress. And then I would like to also open up the conversation more to engaging with all of you who are present. And so I'm going to start, I'm going to read from Nahanda the Beautiful Ones, and the character I'm reading is called Sadim, and he is in a place called Orun, and he is contemplating his existence. Nobody thirsts in Orun. Humans thirst. Nobody hungers in Orun. Humans hunger. Nobody wants in Orun. Humans want. Nobody gets weary in Orun, but they returned worn. Awela Grove was filled with rustles as he worked. He pinched his thin wispy twigs of hands, handling each flower like the most delicate things in all of the world. Awela Grove glistened with a multitude of colors as the flowers of destiny glimmered before his dark slanted eyes. He watched the 7 suns that still remained shut for their return. It both intrigued and frightened him that they never returned the same. Those that used to stand tall came back wobbly and bended. Those that used to color the heavens with their blazes returned with only a few sparks crackling, and the brave, they returned cowering. He floated on the bridge between the grove and far beyond where his eyes could see the far edges of Orun, where the door of many returns stood. Great bulbous clouds billowed in purples and blues above him, playing hide and seek with the great round silver mother of the skies and her 7 sons. The clouds were winning in the heavenly sport and rumbled in great content at their victory. He too had once ruled and fought for something he would later understand to not be peace. He needed the solidity of Orun, where peace was neither discussed nor debated. He clutched the book in his dark wispy twigs for hands, still looking to the skies. The book showed everything. From the now before, the book told the story of everything. The book knew everyone's names, the names of those who had taken it going, the names of those on their return. He remembered his own return. After bidding his time in Mutapa, in a body made of flesh, limbs, and bones, he had been forced to return. It was all his own doings that had led to his undoings. He should have known better than to trust that time would always grant him the ability to raise his anima in a mortal body every day when that one sun in Mutapa rose, summoning him to his daily human bustle. If he had kept this thought in his comprehension, he might have fared better in Mutapa, but like most of them, he had given in to his humanness. He had been sitting in the great hall of his house when it happened, when his armor of flesh and bones started to betray him. He had been poisoned, which made his anima fight his body for weeks on end without a sight of release. Body and spirit entangled in a fight that made him blood weary, flesh ailing, and bone aching. Men in great cloaks came, but his anima was winning. Women in cloaks came with caped masses of smokes following them, but his animal was relentless in its grapple with leaving a decaying body. He heard the whispers of his subjects about where they would bury him. He had been a thin, uncomfortable spike in the heels of those he oversaw and ruled over. With gold at his touch, there was nothing that could interrupt his ambitions. He had been a king, or something close to a king in Mutapa, but kings must also die. So in his delirium, when the time came to choose a lane in the forking path, he had chosen the long, thin road instead of walking back into his body. He had chosen the road to Orun, unconfident that its doors would be open to him. He knew where and how to catch the tail of an Asumari. He traced back the streets he once used to rule, floating instead of walking, and this time with the wide open sight of his anima. He found others too, limping, frail, and some even joyfully running towards the tail of the Asumari. There were many Asumari landing and rising on a platform that only those they called out could see. Ophidians of the sky, they were large and scaly, with comfortable scarlet seat inside, for the animals of those who toiled for peace until their very last breath. Those who chose peace even after betrayals, those who chose peace even after deaths and execution. The tail of the Asumari was also there for those who tried to seek the face of peace, but for reasons only relevant to peace, peace had hid her face from them. He didn't know how these distinctions were made, but he knew that the door of many returns were kind and knew all their hearts. So I would like to open the floor to an engagement from all of you.
I have a question. So a lot of this work is heavy and there's a lot of anger, and rightfully so. How do you balance that or navigate that with like joy just as an activist and as a human?
I think both can coexist. Both my joy and my anger coexist. And I can be both angry, and I am very angry, as you said, rightfully so. But I'm also, carving spaces of joy is also very important, especially when your joy is always stolen or taken from you. So I think as much as I am angry, I also see the value in joy and cultivating spaces of joy and healing and
Thank you.
I also had a question. You brought up earlier, James Baldwin said in his lecture that artists help people see reality again. And I think it was either in your, I don't know if it was a spoken word or like a video, because I didn't see anything when I watched it. But I think it was called like Shape of Rage or On Rage. And at the end, you said that the world had not made space for her rage. So how do you tell the real reality of a narrative or a story that has no place?
I think the trick is to make place for it. And that's also why we have conversations like these ones and where we gather and especially in the city of Berlin, I can say that there has been a lot of efforts where Black people and people of African descent could gather and sit together in these safer spaces. And I think there's a great value in collaborating and also sitting. And I think also in the shape of my anger, I mentioned also a lot of people who come before me. And I think if you notice, a lot of people like James Baldwin, the people who I also mentioned before, all of these people, what they all have in common is they believed in community, like the stronghold and the actual community of gathering and sharing ideas and disagreeing respectfully. And so I think that is where the work for me is at this point as an activist. And that's also why I mentioned earlier that I don't think I want to explain racism to like white people anymore. I don't think, because so many people have been here who have actually done that, and the work is there. I think it's quite understood, the topic. And so I think the work right now is to create these spaces where, for example, Black women can be angry, and it's okay, and that your anger, it's here. You can't take it away, but what you can do is to channel it or to like communicate it to people who can hold you when you can't hold yourself. So I think there's a great value in that, especially in communal work and in reaching out as well to each other, whether it's writing poetry to each other or writing about each other or sharing stories of our thriving or sharing strategies of our existence as well.
Yeah.
I have a question. You talked a lot about not eliminating, but not focusing on the white gaze in your narration. And also James Baldwin was talking about how we should be conscious of our positionality and detach from it while writing. I was wondering, how do you tell what are elements of the white gaze, as it's the dominant culture and it's really hard to dissociate yourself from that, not to mention other intersectional parts of your identity? And how do you tell what parts of your identity are helpful to your storytelling and what parts need to be detached because they are not truly you?
Oh, well, thank you so much for this question. I think this happened to me when I was writing, or when the work in progress I just read and that I was busy with, because I was trying to create a fantasy realm. And I realized how much my fantasy realm actually mirrored in so many ways the only stories that we know, colonialism of this. And actually I had to travel, like I went under depression because I literally could not imagine, to put it that way, I could not imagine myself out of this box. And I found it very sad. I found it also unbelievable how much of it, the gaze I've also internalized. And I think I went around my community as well, asking people, hey, do you recognize her when this pops up in your stories, or when this happens and you unintentionally like include something that is part of your experience, but that you did not want to include, like you say. And I think it is part of my experience, but also it has also been beautiful to I think even transcend those kind of, transcend sounds a bit like, like gurish, but I would say thinking outside of that for me has been the art, like trying to actually think, because I think that's also what Afrofuturism is, like thinking ourselves outside, like who are we when they are not watching? And I think that's also the stories like of my grandmother, because when I grew up in my family, white people were not peeping through the windows. I mean, their systems impacted us, but we had birthday parties. Me and my sister played outside, even though I was born in apartheid South Africa. So the joy exists. That's all I can say. The joy exists. And once you find the joy and you realize the joy exists, and it does exist simultaneously with all of these other things, I think, yeah, find the joy.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question kind of based off James Baldwin's speech, where he talks about like when you're becoming an artist, like what is the self and what is it expressing. And I was just curious as how you defined yourself as a writer and a spiritual healer based on this?
I think identity is very multi-layered and a very complex thing. And as an artist, I think I'm a writer, and so I do identify as an artist. But I think, like I mentioned before, I always feel like I'm a kind of kidnapped Renaissance African poet that without the gaze or without the politics of my existence, that maybe I would be writing Renaissance poetry for African people instead of having to constantly talk about this other thing called racism and so I think my identity is also, if I look back from my journey as an artist, it's changed a lot. Certain things have changed, certain things I've claimed, certain things I've taken away. And maybe in 5 years, I'll feel differently about certain things. And so I don't think of identity as something that's stationary. I think it's very fluid.
I have a quick question, or maybe not a quick question, but so other artists that we've spoken with and some that we've read have talked about the role of the body in art, and sort of not only in sort of grasping that knowledge from movement, but also like listening to your inner self, your instinct, your and I was wondering if you could speak to if that rings true for you, and if it integrates into your work.
Oh, indeed. I think it's very much integrated into my work because also there is, when I think of like the education I received, just to give you a little context, I went to an all-girl Catholic school, okay? And so, which I learned a lot of Western canon literature. And you can think about it, I'm living in South Africa and I'm like 13, 14, reading the diary of Anne Frank. Do you understand? Like, so I always felt that what happened with Western, what happened with Western intrusion is like kind of disembodied. And I talk a little bit about this, but I feel like the disembodiment of having it's almost like in the West, like as an African, I would think about it as the West having your head cut off from your body and you're just dealing with matters of the head. And so remembering this is me like trying to literally connect my body back together. And you do this also, I have tried to do this by literally going through my family archives. I've tried to do this and this kind of dismembering and this reckoning, and intentionally, I think also tending to, that happens to that I have to tend to all the histories that I carry, that I'm not even some of them aware that I carry. And this tending, and I use the word tending because it's like a taking care of, because I have a daughter growing up in Europe who's literally having a totally different experience than I am, but she's growing up as a Black girl in a different context. And I've also realized how much this disembodied knowledge moves, especially in the diaspora, where it's very sad for me, actually, also as an Indigenous healer, when I realize how many people, like, for example, can't even trace their lineages back, who are Black or in the diaspora, can't trace their lineages back 3 generations, like can't trace back their lineages, like so many gaps in our archives as Black people, and intentional erasure. So I think it is a lot of painstaking work, this embodiment work, but it's quite a big part of why I write or the work I try to produce. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a question.
I had a question. So I was kind of wondering, back on the topic of identity, I was kind of curious if, as you kind of were just talking about how like your work as an Indigenous healer does have an impact, or possibly like intersects with your work as an artist, and kind of like what that looks like.
What did, excuse me, please?
Oh, sorry. So tying back to the topic of identity and what you were just mentioning, I was curious how your work as an Indigenous healer intersects or has an impact on your work as an artist, or maybe it's vice versa.
I think they're very connected. Like I think I told you before, like in my tradition in South Africa, healing and storytelling are kind of things that are kind of connected. Storytellers are healers because they're keepers of memory. And when you keep memory, as we've seen with white supremacy, you can change memory very quickly, and it can impact generations. So it is very tied together work because by remembering, by writing, I'm also healing. And also, I do work with members of my community doing healing practices. But I think right now I've been more focused on doing my own work, my own inner work, and like connecting my own dots before thinking I figured it out for everybody else. And so, yeah, that's also, it's very connected. Yeah, there's no separation between the two.
There's a question in the chat. Are you able to tell differences in how people interpret your work based on where it is shown or where you perform it or where it's written? So this is a question, I believe, about reception of your work.
Oh, okay. I think what can I tell about people based?
Based on the differences of where you are in what context you are, in Europe versus South Africa versus.
Oh, of course. I think yes, indeed. Like in South Africa, I think people like, yeah, storytelling and being a poet is seen very differently than in Europe. And also people do perceive me differently, but I also don't, I'm a very selfish artist in that I really don't care about my audience as much as I should probably. But I think I'm a very selfish artist in that I just try to create what makes sense to me. And if people receive it differently, I'm just like, oh well. And yeah, so I think that's also been a big part of it. And also I think taking this feeling of being watched, I think out of performance or this, especially as a Black body who's constantly moving around and constantly feeling watched. So I think within my art, I've tried to create a safe space for myself where I literally don't care who's watching.
And another question in the chat. What is your favorite piece that you've worked on to this day and why? Could you also talk a little about the meaning and symbolism represented in the Hluo piece that you shared with us for our conversation today? So in the video.
I think actually the gungun, the masking was one of my favorite things I created. Or yeah, there was another gungun I created afterwards. I don't think I've shared this one with you, but I made a figure made out of raffia, and yeah, so I think that would be my favorite, but it's also similar to the other one because I use a lot of ritual masking. And I think I intentionally also use that because the mask in many African tradition is used as a kind of spiritual entity that shows up to interrogate society. And so I've thought it like a great way. I think also because I have a lot of anxiety showing up on stages. So I was always like, oh no. So it was also cool to be invisible, but visible in a way that makes sense, or to not have your face. Like, I don't know, like to have a different face. And so there was, especially the first piece of masking, because I was always very fast just before people's eyes. And so for me, that fascinated me with creating this work, and also finding out that how, like in West Africa, ekunguns, which are the mask figures, they can go into society and like beat up the bad politicians and stuff like that. So I thought that would be like a good like for like kind of interpretation of interventions, especially public interventions for today. So I thought, yeah, so that's also why what actually inspired me to use the masking.
I have a question. We talk in class a lot about art and resistance and the interconnectedness between the two of them. And I was wondering, from your point of view, where would you put resistance within your art, or vice versa? Is all of your art made to be a form of resistance, or does it serve more purposes for you or your identity?
Thank you so much for your question. I think I create first, and also in the beginning when I started to write, I didn't really think of myself as resisting or as it being a form of resistance. And I also didn't know like that I was an activist. I think about it as well with my grandmother. My grandmother was a feminist, but an intersectional feminist, but she just did not call herself an intersectional feminist. You understand? So I think that's also kind of what gets into play, because I started writing to empower myself, to see if other members in my community felt the same way. I specifically sought out Black spaces to perform and talk to others, specifically Black femme, queer people. And so the resistance, I think, is because our bodies are politicized. You know, we lived in very political bodies, and especially as Black queer people, our bodies are political. Like, so I think that's where whatever we do, even Black girls twerking on TikTok, it will always be resistance. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
I have a question. Have you considered writing for the stage at all? Being a playwright, putting your poetry or your book, making it visual, I guess you would say, for public consumption, although I don't really want to use that word in this context. But yes, I basically you perform your poetry by yourself and you write for us. Have you ever thought about putting your writing on stage in that way?
Actually, no. But I once wrote a very short story that another friend of mine did turn into something from stage. And so I haven't, I think it's also because as writers, we are very solitary, aren't we? We're always sitting by ourselves, writing, creating. And so I think I will think about it a lot in the next coming probably months. And I might do it.
Wonderful. As you were reading your book, your coming book, your writing is so picturesque that my imagination was saying this should be on a screen or on a stage, or it brings me to want to see it. So this is why I wondered if you had considered doing something along those lines.
Thank you.
More about the genre of fantasy, and like what you find specifically or particularly productive about this genre that you might not find in other spaces.
I think its ability to leave this world, which also speaks to Afrofutures and Afrofuturistic works. And I think for me, that's what it is. I think it's the seeking of enchantment. It's the seeking of, I think it's very escapist, like wanting to get away and creating this kind of non-physical space where people can run away to, I think is a very empowering thing.
I know earlier you talked about while you were working on your novel that it was very hard for you to kind of separate that the white gaze from like the world you were trying to create. Can you speak about like some of the ways or methods you use in order to try to separate the white gaze from your work? Because I know you said it was difficult for you to figure out.
Yeah, it was quite difficult. And I think one of the easiest way I found to navigate it was I have a 9-year-old who's naturally always thinking in fantasy. So I think that's what I started to do. I started to build more forts. I started to go on the merry-go-round again. I started to just see a puddle and run to it and say paddle and jump. And, I was just searching for magic everywhere, everywhere. So I think that was like, yeah, this kind of sitting down and just letting it, like, yeah, letting, because also even when it's not there, because of this, it becomes a trigger where you're always envisioning it's like a ghost. And so I think for me it was, yeah, that getting myself out of it included being a child again. And I think that's also why I wanted to write fantasy, because I wanted to feel that enchantment, that magic of, oh my God. And I want that for also Black people and specifically Black femme people, like spaces where they can go, oh my God.
There's something, I'm also a mom of a 6.5-year-old, and there's something about, I don't know, the extension of your body into the child that also makes that more possible somehow. Like you experience the world through your own eyes and in your own body, but then also through theirs somehow because of that connection. Yeah, I really love that sort of the child's play aspect to what you're
Yeah,
saying.
and actually my daughter unintentionally created one of the sub characters as well of my book. Well, she didn't do it intentionally. She was just telling me about something fantastical. And I was like, tell me more. And she kept making up the story on and on and on and on. And I was like, tell me more. What does it look like? And so that was also being, yeah, part of the process. Like, I think seeing the world again.
Yeah,
Seeing
and they're
reality.
also, yeah, they're not beholden, children are not beholden to the same sort of categories and
Yeah,
rules.
they did not read bell hooks. They did not. So, and
Exactly.
so I think, yeah, there's still innocence there that is enchanting and beautiful.
Well, you've shared in that way how your daughter inspires your work, but I wonder if there is, and I'm sure there is, intention in you that you are writing your work and your words for your daughter.
Oh, indeed. I write her a lot of letters. I think that's also in part, I'll just share a little bit of trauma. My mom died when I was 6, so I was raised by my grandmother. So, and what I loved about my mom was she kept a diary. And so I think that also inspired me to write to my daughter. So like to continue the writing, like to just, I want her to find pieces of me everywhere. When she's cleaning the house, find a crumpled note behind it. Like she will find letters everywhere.
Well, do we have another question before we close? It's just about that time. Can we have a last one? Or Goitse, do you have some last words that you'd like to share with us?
I can read you a poem. I will leave you guys with a poem. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yes. Okay, I found a poem. And this is a very beautiful poem, actually. I have lots of poems with me, and I just chose one randomly. And I will share it, and it's called How to Break. How to break. Crack, open, break, and then fall apart. It is what galaxies are made of. How to break, turning hurt into beautiful things. I bid you heal, but break. Break into laughter, break into dance, cry, break into poems that will help others break their breath, then break. I bid you heal, but break. We are all mirrors, reflecting back and forth into each other and playing with our shadows, crack open, break. Grow forests from your misery. Parade your shame and don't shame your dark. Love it, like the beautiful pieces of home you keep tucked away for days when this home is too sour to palate. Make your house a refuge for casualties of intrusive thoughts, regrets who sailor into your mind, trailing broken legs or hearts. Knit them together, crack open, break, and then fall apart. Turn your hurt into beautiful things. I bid you heal, but break.
Oh, what a way to end. And I'm not crying here, but thank you, Goitseone, for spending so much time with us today and for such a powerful discussion. As always, we're grateful for Emily and Davidson College for making these important conversations possible, and to our students' contributions that make them especially rewarding. Today's recording will soon be available on our YouTube channel at Black Germans. Please subscribe and turn on the notifications so that you will be alerted as new videos are added. Visit our website at bghra.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Eventbrite for details about future events and the annual conference in February. We hope that you've enjoyed today's discussion as much as we have. And until next time, thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.